Hello. The Divine Code reading for August 25th, pages 157 and 158. We're in the chapter, Which Action Makes One Liable for Idol Worship? Topic number 11. What is the ruling for two who participate in slaughtering one animal, whether one after another or together, with one or two knives? So two people are participating in slaughtering an animal, and one person does it once and then the other person continues. So let's say, okay, according to halakhic slaughtering for the temple, it's considered slaughtered when it's 51% of the esophagus or the wind or the windpipe is severed. When more than when the majority of one of those is severed, it's considered slaughtered. So later on, we'll know that if once it's slaughtered, it can't continue to be slaughtered. Therefore, this is a case where two people are, the first person slaughters less than 50%, and the other person continues to finish it over 51%, makes it 51% or more. Or they're both holding, maybe it's two ends of a knife. It's a big animal, and they're both holding the knife together. Here, slaughtering means the act of cutting the majority of both the esophagus and the windpipe of an animal, or the majority of one of these for a bird, starting with the beginning of the cut. If one slaughtered and voiced his intentions, and normally we don't mention the necessity of voicing one's intentions. What's necessary is that it's obviously for the idol worship. And we'll find in the next halakha, they'll mention other reasons a person might do this in front of an idol. So in order for liability, it has to be obvious the person's doing it, and the most obvious way is that the person says that's why he's doing it. So if one slaughtered and voiced his intentions for idol worship, and the second one had no such intention, the one who slaughtered for an idol is liable and the other is exempt, regardless of the order in which they slaughtered. And if both slaughtered for an idol, either the same or a different idol, they are both liable. So it could be that the voicing of the intention is specific for this, because so if both of them are involved in the slaughtering for an idol, and let's say the first person cuts at 30%, the next person cuts at 25%, now it's up to 55%. Both of the actions were necessary for the slaughter to take place. So as we later learn in the case of murder, only the last person would be considered liable in the case of murder for completing the action. In this case, both are considered liable if they're doing it for the sake of the idol worship. If they're doing it not for the sake of the idol worship, where they don't say they're doing it for the sake of the idol worship, only the one of the partner who did it for that sake, because it was part of the completion of the action. The action couldn't have been complete unless both of them did their part. That is the person that would be considered liable. The other person would not be considered liable, even though his action participated and was required for the completion of the first person's action. And we'll learn in the next topic, also today, other reasons why a person might do it in front of an idol. It is clear in any case, two people who perform an act of slaughter have the ruling of one who slaughters, as is explained in Shokanor Eurydeia, end of chapter 2 and chapter 5. Therefore, it is considered slaughtering for idols, and it has been previously explained that there is no measurement for slaughter for an idol to make one liable. So we learned earlier that all it takes is a little nick in the slaughtering process, enough that the animal will eventually die, that would be sufficient for the person. But in the case of a partnership, the question is whether or not both people would be liable. If an animal has already been fully slaughtered, as defined by the amount of cutting through the nick passages as specified above. So the nick has to be, the esophagus and the windpipe have to be 51%. The majority has to be cut. So if the animal's already had the majority of the esophagus and the windpipe cut, regardless of whether or not the act of slaughtering was intended for idol worship. So it could be if the person did not do it for the purpose of idol worship, as we'll learn in the next topic. Another person then cut through the minority that remained of the passages with an intention for idol worship. So somebody else comes along and the first person cuts it 51% for a reason other than idol worship. The second person wants to do it for the sake of the idol, and therefore he cuts the other 49%. But it's already considered slaughtered because the 51% has been cut. Therefore, the rest of the slaughter, the rest of the cutting doesn't count towards. It's only if the first person cut 49%, and the second person comes along and just finishes out finishes the last 2% to make it a majority, then it would be considered a slaughter. But if it's already gone past the 51%, the majority percent, anything done with the cutting after that would not be considered slaughter in this case. Now, perhaps it would be considered cutting, breaking a stick, which we talked about before. If the animal was used in the idolatry in some manner, but what we're talking about here is specific to slaughter. And in that case, he is exempt from liability. And Shak Eurydeia 2:27, that for a Gentile, the last small bit of cutting through the passages is not called slaughtering, even if the animal was still convulsing, since the act of slaughter was already fully accomplished. His action of cutting the remaining part of the passages of the dying animal only served to hasten the animal's death, and is not considered to be an act of slaughtering. The same ruling applies if one slaughtered up to the completion point without the intention of idol worship, and then changed his mind and continued cutting the remaining part of the passages with the intention of idol worship. So the animal, for the sake of slaughter, now for the sake of limb of a living animal, which is a different section of the book, the prohibition of eating a limb of a living animal, for that sake, the animal is still considered alive. But for the sake of slaughter, because slaughter connects to the holy temple. And therefore, in this case of the holy temple, the person would use, and even in the case of a non-Jew doing a sacrifice on a private altar to God, in those cases, slaughter is the Jewish style of slaughter, which is what's being talked about here. Elsewhere, the rules are different, but in this halak, in this instance, it's the type that's used in the temple that we're talking about. Type of slaughter used in the temple. Now, it also states here that in the case where the person originally did the cut, the 49% of the cut, just under a minority of the cut, he does for the sake of another purpose, which we'll discuss in the next topic. But then he decides that he's going to dedicate that last little part of his cut, putting it over the majority of the esophagus and windpipe. He decides he's going to do that for the sake of the idol worship. That makes him involved, that person involved in slaughtering for the sake of idol worship, because there's no minimum requirement as to how much the cut has to be for the sake of idol worship, as long as it's part of going up to the majority. When does this apply? If it is done in the service of an idol, which was not traditionally served by sacrificing animals, or by other means of service with the carcass of the animal, he would therefore only be liable for performing one of the temple services in the worship of an idol. Once most of the two passages, or one passage for the bird, these are the gullet and the windpipe, are already cut, his subsequent action of cutting is not considered to be an act of slaughtering. So if a person did 51% of the cut, he cut through 51% of the passages, the esophagus or the windpipe, and the windpipe. He did 51% for the sake of the of the remedy spoken of in the next topic, and then did the rest of the cut, continued with the cut. He would not be considered liable in that case if he did the rest of the cut for the sake of the idol worship, because the animal at that point is already slaughtered once it gets up to 51%. However, if it was the idol's traditional manner of service, even if he slaughtered the animal that was convulsing in the death throes. Now here again, it's when the divine code says it was the animal's traditional manner of service, it's referring to if the animal is used in the traditional manner, therefore it becomes like breaking a stick. If the stick is waved in front of the altar, that's a normal way of doing it, and the person breaks the stick, that's considered to be like slaughter because the stick is already used. Even though you can't slaughter a stick, it doesn't make any sense. So in that case, if the animal is used, if a person waves an animal in front of an altar, that's a normal way of that's normal service. And a person cut, because once it's slaughtered, it's for the sake of the temple, for the sake of temple service, it's considered dead once it's slaughtered. Once at 51%, even if it's still thrashing about or whatever, it's considered slaughtered at 51%. If the animal is already a carcass at that point, because it was up to 51%, it's already dead, and the person continues cutting the animal, in that case, where the animal is used in other methods of service for the idol, In that case, the continued cut would be considered stealth slaughtering. Or if he cut the head off for the sake of the idol, even after the animal's death. So the animal died already. I mean, it's not thrashing about it. It's 10 minutes later, and it's dead. Even if it cuts it at that point, it would still, he is liable for a capital sin since it resembles the act of slaughtering, as was explained earlier. Where, yeah, it's like breaking a stick. For a Gentile, an animal convulsing in the death throes is to be considered as still alive, and it is forbidden for a Gentile to sever the limb and eat a limb from it, as is the ruling for a living animal. Therefore, the last bit of slaughtering by a Gentile as idol worship is considered an act of sacrificing, and one is liable for this. However, if the animal is already dead, and he only cut it a little, but did not separate the neck, the head from the neck, or break any joints in the neck, he does not commit any meaningful action, and this is not comparable to breaking a stick in the service of an idol. Therefore, that person would not be liable. So if the animal's convulsing, because this is one of those technical things apparently between the Jewish and the non-Jewish halakkas in this regard, because there is the prohibition of eating the limb of a living animal. That would be taking an animal, even if it's in the convulsing stage after it's been technically slaughtered, and it's still convulsing. If a non-Jew severs a limb from that animal, takes a chunk of the leg off in those last few minutes and takes a bite out of it. After severing the limb, then he takes a bite out of it. That would be the prohibition of eating the limb of a living animal. For a Jew, that would not be considered the prohibition. Therefore, there's this kind of a quasi area between the two halakkas. So, for the sake of a non-Jew, if he continued cutting at that point, the animal is still considered alive. Even though, for the sake of the temple service, which is what we're comparing all this to in this point, the animal would technically be dead. Therefore, the Gentile who continues cutting the neck of the animal while it's going through that stage, the stage of dying, that action would be considered continuing the slaughter in this specific case. Once, assuming the animal was used in, this is a lot of parts to it, assuming the animal was used in some other manner before that idol. If the animal is not used, then this would not be a case at this point. And once the animal is fully dead, it no longer has that status of limb of a living animal for a non-Jew. Therefore, that no longer applies. Once the animal's dead, it would not, that little extra cutting of the esophagus and windpipe would not count as slaughter, unless the person did a severing that would be like changing the status of the animal, like cutting the head off the animal. It would be changing in a significant way the animal. So this is an area where there's a slight difference between the Jewish and the non-Jewish halakkas in this area. Topic number 12. One who slaughters to the mountains or valleys, sun, moon, or constellations, seas or rivers, angels, or the like. So these are all natural fixed items. These are not, this is not a case where a person made an idol out of wood or metal. But if it's a natural existing thing that people serve as idols. You know, someone takes a mountain, they say, okay, we're going to turn this into idol worship. Well, does that mean that nobody else is allowed to use the mountain? And we talk about that later on in this section, in the unit. If he does not have the intent, okay, one who slaughters to these things and intends to serve it, this is idol worship, and he is liable for a capital sin. So if a person is serving the idol, the mountain that's considered an idol, and if he slaughters an animal for the sake of worshiping that the mountain as an idol, then that would be a capital sin. If he does not have the intention to serve the entity as an idol, but rather he only slaughters for the purpose of the healing remedy and the like, from the various foolish superstitions of idol worshippers. This is a transgression, but does not incur liability for a capital sin. So let's say there's a pseudo, the doctors in the area think, it's within their culture, they think that by slaughtering an animal by the mountain, that creates some kind of a benefit to the person, health benefit, you know, whatever reason. So he's doing it for the sake of, because that's understood to work in a scientific manner, not as idol worship, but just doing the action benefits. You know, doing the action by the mountain does something. In that case, it would not, you know, the person thinks that that's just the way that the nature works. In that case, it would not be considered idol worship. See Tractate Kulin 40a, Rambam, Laws of Ritual Slaughter 2:14, Shokan or Yoredea, chapter 4, and Shak Yoredea 4:8 there. That whether one serves mountains, angels, or anything else, if his intentions is for success, luck, or healing, or if he is serving it only from love or fear. When it says love or fear, it's the person, it's what everyone does in the community. It's what his family does, and therefore, out of the love for the family, he does this action, not because he's doing it for the sake of the idol, or he fears. Maybe he fears what the community might do to him, or he fears what the family might do to him if he doesn't do this action, or he fears if he doesn't do the action of nature, a natural occurrence might occur, like an earthquake. If he doesn't do this action, it's not that he views it as, he sees it as a scientific natural reaction. And on the outside, it may seem like he's doing it in an idolatrous manner, but it's the intent is very important in the laws of idolatry. Then this is not an act of idol worship that one is liable for, although it is still forbidden. And see topic 27 below. So it's still, we shouldn't do these things. I mean it might be hard to say, if a person does something because he fears his community, or does something because he loves his community, it's still forbidden to do the action, but it's not considered something that the person is liable in a court for. He shouldn't do it. He should stand up for what he believes. He should speak truth to power. But from a practical standpoint, you can't always do that. It doesn't change the fact that it's forbidden. It just kind of gives him an excuse to do something he shouldn't do. It's still you can't do it, but it's understandable. The only debate there is regarding whether an animal becomes forbidden for Jewish consumption and benefit by the Torah or by decree of the sages. For the question of allowing it to be used for Jewish benefit, whether it should be included in the same category as animals that have been sacrificed to idols. But all agree that slaughtering of this type of intention to any entity is a form of worship. So in the area of whether or not it can be used for benefit. So if the slaughter is done because he feared his community, is he then allowed to benefit from the animal that he slaughtered? And that's sort of the question that's being asked here, as to whether or not it's forbidden. Thank you.